November 22nd, 1963, Fort Worth, Texas. A damp Friday morning. The kind of morning where the air feels heavy and the sky can't decide what it wants to do. Inside the Hotel Texas, President John F. Kennedy woke up, ate breakfast, and stepped outside to greet a crowd that had gathered in a parking lot, in the rain, just to catch a glimpse of him. He cracked a joke about his wife taking longer to get ready. The crowd roared with laughter. He smiled that easy, movie star smile of his. He had no idea it was the last morning of his life. By midday, Air Force One had touched down at Dallas Love Field. Kennedy and First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy stepped off the plane to a sea of flowers, cheers, and waving flags. Jackie wore a pink wool suit and a matching pillbox hat. The president looked tanned, relaxed, alive. The plan was simple: a motorcade through the streets of Dallas, a quick speech at the Trade Mart, then back to Washington. Simple enough, except nothing about that day would end simply. Dallas in 1963 was not a friendly place for John Kennedy. It was a city where wealthy oilmen and right-wing businessmen openly despised Kennedy's politics, his push for civil rights, his negotiations with the Soviets, his refusal to go to war over Cuba. Political bumper stickers on Dallas cars read things that would get you banned from social media today. Newspapers ran full-page attack ads. The hostility was real, and it was loud. Just a month before Kennedy's visit, United Nations Ambassador Adlai Stevenson had been attacked in Dallas, physically hit by a protester, spat on, shoved. He had called Washington afterward and warned, "This city is dangerous right now. Do not send the president." That warning reached the White House. It was noted, and then it was ignored. A local Dallas businessman also reportedly phoned both the White House and the FBI in the days before the visit, saying the atmosphere in the city was too hostile for a presidential appearance. That call went nowhere. Kennedy himself had been warned by friends, advisors, and political allies not to make this trip. He went anyway. Why? Because 1964 was an election year. Texas had 25 electoral votes, and Kennedy knew that if he couldn't hold Texas, he was in trouble. So he came to Dallas not as a tourist, but as a politician willing to walk into a room that didn't want him, because that's what the math demanded. That decision would cost him everything. When you're moving a president through a major city, the Secret Service has one job above all others: control the environment, control the route, control the crowd lines, control the sight lines, eliminate the unknown variables. For Dallas, there were two possible routes from Love Field to the Trade Mart. The first was a straight shot, fast, efficient, minimal exposure. The motorcade could bypass the downtown core almost entirely and arrive at the Trade Mart in under 20 minutes with limited public contact. Kennedy rejected that option. He wanted the second route, the long way through the heart of the city. Down Main Street, through the crowds, past the cheering faces, all the way through Dealey Plaza. He wanted Dallas to see him. He wanted to prove that he wasn't afraid of this city, that it couldn't rattle him, that the connection between a president and his people was stronger than any political hostility. The route was published in the Dallas Morning News the day before the motorcade. Every turn, every street, every landmark. Printed for the whole city and anyone in it to read. That published route took the motorcade past a 7-story building on the corner of Elm and North Houston. The Texas Schoolbook Depository. Lee Harvey Oswald was 24 years old and had already lived about 5 different lives by the time November 1963 rolled around. He had been a U.S. Marine, a defector to the Soviet Union, a factory worker in Minsk, a husband to a Russian woman named Marina, and then, somehow, a man who had been allowed to come back to America with his Soviet wife and his Soviet past, no questions asked, during the height of the Cold War. That alone has raised eyebrows for 60 years. Back in the United States, Oswald had drifted. New Orleans, Mexico City, Dallas. He handed out pro-Castro leaflets on street corners. He ordered a mail-order rifle under a fake name. He was fired from jobs. He argued with his wife. He was a man with a political worldview and a grudge, but exactly who that grudge was aimed at remained, and still remains, genuinely unclear. On the morning of November 22nd, Oswald showed up at his job at the Texas School Book Depository. A coworker had given him a ride. Oswald said he was carrying curtain rods in a long paper bag. That coworker later testified the bag was too short for curtain rods. At 12:30 p.m., Oswald was not at his workstation on the first floor. He was on the 6th floor, with a view of the street below that was perfectly, almost surgically aligned with the path of the presidential motorcade. You cannot fully prepare yourself for what comes next. The motorcade turned left onto Houston Street, and then made a sharp left turn onto Elm Street, heading into the open ground of Dealey Plaza. The crowds were thinner here than on Main Street. The limousine slowed to navigate the turn. Jacqueline Kennedy turned to her husband. The crowd was still cheering. She smiled and said something along the lines of, "You can't say Dallas doesn't love you." He laughed. Then the first shot rang out. There was always confusion about the first shot. People in the crowd thought it was a car backfire, a motorcycle exhaust, a firecracker. The sound echoed off the concrete walls and the underpasses and the buildings, bouncing around in ways that made it impossible to instantly locate the source. The second shot found its mark. It entered the back of President Kennedy's neck, tore through his throat, and kept going, striking Governor John Connally in the back, shattering a rib, blasting through his wrist, and lodging in his thigh. Connally screamed. His wife Nellie pulled him toward her, crying his name. Then the third shot. It hit Kennedy in the head. The impact was catastrophic and instantaneous. Kennedy lurched forward and then collapsed sideways. Jacqueline Kennedy, reacting in a state of pure shock, climbed partially onto the trunk of the still-moving limousine. Secret Service agent Clint Hill sprinted forward, lunged onto the moving vehicle, and pushed her back into the seat. Driver Bill Greer floored the accelerator. The limousine tore out of Dealey Plaza at full speed toward Parkland Memorial Hospital. Behind it, Dealey Plaza had turned into a scene of absolute chaos. People were screaming, running, diving to the ground. Nobody knew where the shots had come from. Nobody knew what had just happened. Except, somewhere in that building behind them, someone did. The limousine screeched into the emergency bay at Parkland Memorial Hospital at approximately 12:38 p.m. The trauma team that met them was not prepared for what they saw. Kennedy was unconscious. The head wound was massive. The doctors worked with everything they had. A tracheotomy cut into his throat to assist breathing, cardiac massage, blood transfusions pushing fluid into a body that could no longer hold it. They were not giving up. They were fighting. But there are wounds that medicine cannot close. At 1 p.m., President John Fitzgerald Kennedy was pronounced dead. Father Oscar Huber administered last rites. Jacqueline Kennedy, still in her blood-soaked pink suit, refused to leave the room. When someone suggested she clean up before facing the press, she refused. She wanted the world to see exactly what had been done. At 1:33 p.m., White House Press Secretary Malcolm Kilduff stepped in front of a camera and announced to the world that the 35th President of the United States was dead. Walter Cronkite removed his glasses on live television, looked at the clock, and told his audience in a voice that barely held together. America went silent. Then it wept. While Kennedy's body was being prepared at Parkland, Lyndon Baines Johnson was rushed to Air Force One under heavy guard. At 2:38 p.m., in the narrow cabin of that aircraft, Lyndon Johnson was sworn in as the 36th President of the United States. The oath was administered by federal judge Sarah T. Hughes. Standing at Johnson's right side, her face blank and hollow, was Jacqueline Kennedy, still wearing that pink suit. That photograph, the swearing in on Air Force One, became one of the most analyzed images in American political history. Some see grief. Some see composure. Some see something darker, though that may say more about the viewer than the photograph. The plane lifted off from Dallas, carrying a dead president, a new president, and a nation that had just lost its footing. Within 90 minutes of the assassination, Dallas police had their man. Lee Harvey Oswald had left the book depository shortly after the shooting. He went home, changed his shirt, picked up a handgun, and left again. Shortly after, a Dallas patrol officer named J.D. Tippett spotted a man matching the broadcast description walking along a residential street and pulled over to question him. Oswald drew his revolver and shot Tippett 4 times. A police officer, in broad daylight, with witnesses watching from their front yards. He ducked into a movie theater without buying a ticket. The cashier noticed and called the police. Officers swarmed the building. Oswald was found in the back row. When they approached him, he stood up, shouted something, and swung. He was wrestled to the ground, handcuffed, and dragged out. At police headquarters, he was interrogated for hours. He denied everything. He said he hadn't shot the president. He said he hadn't shot Tippett. He said he was being set up. He used a specific word, one that has echoed through every conspiracy theory ever written about this case. I'm just a patsy. The evidence against him was substantial. The rifle on the 6th floor, traced to a mail order purchase under a fake name that matched Oswald's handwriting. Fingerprints. A photograph of Oswald posing with that same rifle. His known movements. The Dallas Police Department was convinced they had their killer. They never got to prove it in a courtroom. 2 days after the assassination, Dallas police announced they would be transferring Oswald from headquarters to the county jail. The transfer would happen through the basement of the police building. Television cameras were allowed in to document it. This decision, allowing cameras, allowing press, allowing members of the public into that basement, is one that law enforcement officials have quietly regretted for 60 years. As Oswald was walked through the basement in handcuffs, flanked by detectives, a man in a hat stepped forward out of the crowd. He pressed a .38 caliber revolver into Oswald's side and fired once. The whole world watched it happen on live television. Oswald crumpled. He was rushed to Parkland Memorial Hospital, the same trauma rooms, the same doctors who had worked on Kennedy 48 hours earlier. This time, they couldn't save him either. At 1:07 p.m. on November 24th, Lee Harvey Oswald was dead. The man who had shot him was Jack Ruby, a Dallas nightclub owner with a temper, a love of dogs, a soft spot for police officers, and documented connections to organized crime figures in Chicago and Dallas. Ruby said he had acted alone. He said he was devastated by Kennedy's death. He said he couldn't stand the thought of Jackie Kennedy sitting through a long, painful murder trial. Many people found this explanation touching. Many others found it convenient. Jack Ruby was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. That conviction was later overturned on appeal. Before a retrial could be held, Ruby was diagnosed with cancer. He died in January 1967. And with him died the last living person who knew exactly why he had walked into that basement and silenced the only man who could answer the world's biggest question. President Lyndon Johnson knew that the United States was teetering on the edge of something dangerous. Rumors were swirling. The country needed answers, and it needed them fast. Johnson established the President's Commission on the Assassination of President Kennedy. It was chaired by Supreme Court Chief Justice Earl Warren, a man of unimpeachable reputation. Among its members was former CIA Director Allen Dulles, the same Allen Dulles that Kennedy had fired after the Bay of Pigs disaster. That appointment raised eyebrows then, and it still does today. Over 10 months, the Warren Commission interviewed 552 witnesses, reviewed thousands of documents and pieces of physical evidence, and produced a report nearly 900 pages long. The conclusion was stated plainly. Lee Harvey Oswald, acting entirely alone, had fired 3 shots from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. There was no conspiracy. There was no second shooter. The case was closed. America wanted to believe that. Some did. Many could not. At the center of the Warren Commission's lone gunman conclusion sat one piece of evidence that its critics called physically impossible. Commission Exhibit 399, a single bullet, found on a stretcher at Parkland Memorial Hospital, in near perfect condition, almost completely intact. This bullet, the commission argued, was responsible for 7 separate wounds across 2 human bodies, entering Kennedy's upper back, exiting through his throat, then entering Connolly's back, shattering a rib, exiting his chest, passing through his wrist, and lodging in his thigh. For this sequence of events to be true, that bullet would have had to change direction multiple times in midair, travel through bone and tissue across an extraordinary distance, and still emerge looking like it had barely been used. Critics, including forensic pathologists, ballistics experts, and independent investigators, argued this was anatomically and physically implausible. A bullet that strikes bone with that kind of force does not come out the other side in pristine condition. It deforms. It fragments. It breaks. Supporters of the commission fired test bullets through similar targets and argued that under the right conditions, a bullet absolutely could remain largely intact. The debate has never been fully resolved. What is not in dispute: if the single bullet theory falls apart, then more than 3 shots were fired. And if more than 3 shots were fired, Oswald could not have been working alone. Multiple witnesses standing in Dealey Plaza on November 22nd reported something the Warren Commission largely set aside. They heard shots from in front of the motorcade, not from the book depository building behind and to the right of the limousine, but from a grassy, sloped area on the right side of Elm Street, just ahead of where Kennedy's car was when the fatal shot landed. This area became known simply as the grassy knoll. Witnesses ran toward that knoll immediately after the shooting, instinctively following the sound. Several reported seeing a puff of smoke from behind a wooden fence at the top of the knoll. A railroad worker on an overpass above said he smelled gunpowder near that same fence. Dallas police officers and sheriff's deputies rushed to the area and found something unusual. The muddy ground behind that fence showed footprints, and the top of the fence showed what appeared to be a mark consistent with a rifle rest. Someone had been there. The Warren Commission reviewed this evidence and concluded it was not sufficient to establish a second shooter. In 1979, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, a second official government investigation, reached a different conclusion. Based in part on acoustic evidence from a police motorcycle recording, the committee concluded there had probably been 4 shots fired in Dealey Plaza, that a second shooter had likely fired from the grassy knoll, and that the assassination was probably the result of a conspiracy. 2 official government investigations, 2 completely opposite conclusions. Kennedy's relationship with the Central Intelligence Agency had been poisoned beyond recovery by the time of his death. After the Bay of Pigs failure, he had privately blamed the CIA for feeding him bad intelligence and setting him up to take the fall for a doomed operation. He reportedly told aides he wanted to dismantle the agency and hand its functions back to the military. He fired Director Allen Dulles. The agency's frustration with Kennedy was institutional and personal. Here was a president who kept pulling back from military action at the last moment, in Cuba, in Southeast Asia, at every pressure point of the Cold War. The mob. Robert Kennedy, the president's brother and attorney general, had declared war on organized crime in America. Under his leadership, federal prosecutions of mob figures increased dramatically. The heat was relentless. Several mob bosses, according to later FBI surveillance recordings, expressed explicit wishes for Kennedy's removal in the most direct possible language. Jack Ruby's connections to organized crime figures, particularly in Chicago and Dallas, were well documented. His presence in that basement has never been satisfactorily explained away. Lyndon B. Johnson. Johnson had powerful reasons to want Kennedy gone, or at minimum, reasons to want to be president himself. He was the most experienced political operator in Washington. He had expected to be the Democratic nominee in 1960 and had been outmaneuvered by a younger, more charismatic senator from Massachusetts. As vice president, he was sidelined, mocked by Kennedy insiders, and according to multiple accounts, was about to be dropped from the 1964 ticket. Johnson gained the presidency within hours of Kennedy's death. He appointed the Warren Commission that investigated the killing. He named as one of its members the CIA director that Kennedy had fired.
No direct evidence has ever been produced that implicates Johnson, but his name has appeared in every serious discussion of this case for 60 years. The Cubans and the Soviets, Oswald's Soviet connections, and his public pro-Castro activities made both foreign powers natural early suspects. But most serious analysts have concluded that neither the Soviet Union nor Cuba would have risked the catastrophic retaliation that killing an American president would have triggered. Khrushchev reportedly wept upon hearing the news. Castro, according to multiple sources, was visibly shaken. If the full story of November 22, 1963 has already been told, if Oswald truly acted alone and the case is genuinely closed, then there is one question nobody has ever answered satisfactorily. Why, more than 60 years later, are there still classified government documents related to this assassination? The JFK Records Act of 1992 required that all assassination-related documents be released to the public no later than 2017. That deadline passed. Successive presidents, citing national security concerns, continued withholding significant portions of the files. Thousands of documents remained classified well into the 2000s. What could those documents possibly contain that would still, 6 decades on, be damaging enough to justify keeping from the American public? What names appear in those files that someone, somewhere, still needs to protect. In 2025, the Trump administration announced it would move forward with releasing the remaining JFK records. Some files were declassified, others were not. Intelligence agencies pushed back hard against full disclosure. The negotiations between transparency and secrecy continued, as they have continued for decades. The stubborn persistence of that secrecy has done more to fuel conspiracy theories than any single piece of physical evidence ever could. Because here's the thing about secrets. Honest governments don't keep them for 60 years about cases they claim are already solved. To understand what was lost on November 22, 1963, you have to understand who John Kennedy actually was before he became a symbol. He was born into money and comfort in Boston in 1917, the second of 9 children in a family that treated ambition the way other families treat oxygen, as the basic requirement for survival. His father had been ambassador to Britain. His older brother Joseph Jr. was being groomed for political greatness. John was the backup plan. Then the war came and rewrote everything. Kennedy served in the South Pacific as the commander of a patrol torpedo boat, PT-109. On the night of August 2, 1943, a Japanese destroyer cut his boat in half in the darkness. 2 of his crew were killed instantly. Kennedy, despite a serious back injury, kept his surviving crew members together in shark-infested waters, towed one badly burned sailor to a small island by gripping the man's life jacket strap between his teeth and swimming for hours, and ultimately organized a rescue over the following days. That story made him a hero. But what it really revealed was something quieter. A man who, when everything went wrong and there was no one else to make a decision, simply decided and kept going. He came home, went into politics, won a seat in Congress, won a Senate seat, wrote a book that won a Pulitzer Prize, ran for vice president, lost narrowly, and turned that narrow defeat into the foundation of a presidential campaign that nobody thought he could win. He won! John Kennedy's presidency lasted 1,036 days. In those days, he stared down a nuclear crisis that had the world's 2 most powerful nations aimed at each other's cities with enough weapons to end human civilization. He chose negotiation when his generals were urging bombardment. The Cuban Missile Crisis is studied in every serious foreign policy program in the world today as a near-perfect example of how catastrophe gets avoided by leaders choosing to stay in the room and keep talking rather than ordering people to start shooting. He launched the space program that put human beings on the moon. He stood at Rice University in 1962 and told a crowd, and through them the entire country, that America would go to the moon not because it was easy, but because it was hard. He poured money into NASA. He expanded its workforce. He built new facilities. 6 years after his death, 2 Americans walked on the lunar surface, and every person alive that day understood whose vision had put them there. He signed executive orders prohibiting racial discrimination in federal employment. He pushed for what would eventually become the Civil Rights Act, even knowing that doing so would cost him the South in the next election. He did it anyway. Under his economic stewardship, American GDP growth climbed from 2.2% to 5.5%. Inflation held steady at 1%. Unemployment fell. He was not a perfect man. His personal life was complicated in ways that history has documented extensively. His foreign policy decisions were sometimes contradictory and occasionally disastrous. But he was also genuinely capable of growth, of changing his mind when the evidence demanded it, of choosing the harder, more honest path when the easier one would have done real damage. That capacity, that willingness to learn and adapt in real time at the highest level of power is rarer than it sounds. And it was gone at 1 p.m. on a Friday afternoon in November. Here's what we know. On November 22, 1963, at 12:30 p.m. in Dallas, Texas, President John F. Kennedy was shot and killed while riding in an open motorcade through Dealey Plaza. Lee Harvey Oswald, a former Marine with Soviet connections and pro-Castro sympathies, was arrested 90 minutes later and charged with the murder. He denied it. 2 days later, he was shot dead on live television by a Dallas nightclub owner named Jack Ruby. The official government investigation concluded Oswald acted alone. A second official government investigation concluded there was probably a conspiracy. Thousands of related documents remained classified for decades. Some still are. Here is what we do not know. Whether Oswald pulled the trigger alone, whether someone was behind that fence on the grassy knoll. Who put Oswald in that building that day, whether he was placed there deliberately or arrived there by coincidence? Why Jack Ruby walked into that basement? Who Ruby was protecting, if anyone? What is in the documents that have never been released? And whether the full, unvarnished story of what happened that afternoon will ever be told to the American people. 62 years. No definitive answer. The eternal flame at Arlington National Cemetery has burned every single day since Jacqueline Kennedy lit it on November 25, 1963. In rain, wind, and snow, it burns. Kennedy was 46 years old. He had been in office less than 3 years. He had plans for a second term. He had plans for the moon, for civil rights, for the Cold War, for the country his children would grow up in. None of that happened. Instead, America got the Vietnam War. It got the assassinations of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King, Jr. It got Watergate. It got decades of eroding public trust in government and its institutions. Whether those things would have happened anyway, whether Kennedy's survival would have changed the trajectory of American history in any meaningful way, is a question historians still argue about, and will argue about forever. What is not arguable is this. On a clear afternoon in a city that didn't particularly want him there, a young president with a great smile and enormous unfinished ambitions rode in an open car through a crowd of 200,000 people. And 3 shots changed everything. Who fired those shots? Why? And who, if anyone, sent them? Some doors, once closed, may never fully open again.